I'm really excited to be talking today with longtime friend and composer Robert Krolage. Bob, you spent the early part of your music career just after college working with an old friend of mine, music producer Ronnie Brooks in Nashville. What was it like being a session musician in the big leagues?
It was fun. It was a lot of pressure, actually. Being a studio musician, I had started out wanting to be primarily a composer and kind of fell into playing for a lot of jingles for Ronnie in Nashville. I didn't really do a lot of country music there, but I played with some guys like Chuck Berry and the Chiffons and the Nashville Symphony, and like I said, just did a ton of radio and TV spots, and that was the main part of my work.
Yeah, I was so impressed. I mean, not that there aren't great players locally, because there are, but when we worked in Nashville a few times, it's like a machine. The Cartage people bring their gear in, they're set up, ready to go. They cut the track in 2 takes, and then they move on to the next session. It's just like, wow, this makes it so easy, you know?
Sure. You have to be on top of your game down there. It was a little odd for me coming from a trained background, studying piano and studying music theory, to the Nashville number system.
1-4-5.
And the 1-4-5s, and everyone would write down a chart as they listened to it go down at the top of the session. Nobody usually brought sheet music to read, so you'd have to basically listen to a guitar player or piano player play it, write down your notes, and then start playing.
Another friend of mine plays, I don't know if he does it anymore, but he played bass for Hank Williams Jr.
Oh.
And he said they never even, in the live shows, they never had a set list. Hank Williams Jr. would just start playing something, and they would be expected to be able to just follow, you know.
Yeah.
Which that has to be really scary. But
that's nerve-wracking. I did that once. I did a gig with Chuck Berry in Nashville, and he came in for one day, and I was part of the pickup band that he used. And so we had to know all of his songs, and he would play the first 4 bars by himself, and the rest of the band was expected to come in on the 5th bar, and we had to know the song and know the key and
wow.
and jump in on bar 5 and start playing. So that was really nerve-wracking.
You did something a few years ago that really impressed me. Even more than that, I mean, it's something that few Americans do. You learned a second language. You learned to speak fluent German. Now, at that time, did you have any plans to go to Germany, or did you just do it because you thought it'd be cool, or what?
No, that was kind of a long process. It took a good 10 years or so before I got comfortable with the language, but I started just as a hobby because I was interested in the sound of the language, and I had studied the language for about 10 years, and then I had done some video work, actually, in Cincinnati, and the company I was doing business with, they had sent me to Germany a lot to do business, and so my language skills got better. And then when I got into composing for German television shows, that was kind of a fluke. I answered an ad in the back of Keyboard magazine that was looking for someone who could compose and speak German. So
yeah, I was going to ask you how you got started.
So I answered the ad not expecting anything to come of it, and lo and behold, I got 2 German TV shows out of it. And then in 2007, I actually went and lived in Munich for the year, and came back in 2008.
You worked mainly on those 2 shows, the German soap opera Sturm der Liebe, Storm of Love?
Storm of Love, yes.
And Soko 5113, which is like a CSI type.
Right, it's a detective show. It's a primetime detective show. It's a little bit like a CSI. It's not as forensic-based, but to tell you the truth, it's more like a British formula, where it's like an old Agatha Christie formula where something happens at the beginning of the show, usually a murder, and then they take an hour to figure out who did it. So it's pretty much the same formula for that.
That sounds pretty cool. Is it Fear ein Drei, or Einen Vierzig Dreizehn, or what?
For the Soko show?
The 5113.
Yeah, in German they would say Soko 5113. And the Soko is actually a franchise in Germany, and they have, I think, 4 or 5 of these, and they're shot in different cities. And the particular Soko that I work on has actually been on the air for around 30 years, if you can believe that. They have a different kind of attitude in Germany, where if they have a show and they have a hit with it, they tend to stay with it, because I don't think they're as ratings-based as U.S. TV shows.
That's very cool. You told me earlier that Sturm der Liebe was the most exported soap opera in Europe, meaning that they sent it to other countries. Do they ever request like a music change when they're remixing the show for a different language, or do they just keep it in German when they do?
The music is the same. They've never requested anything different. In Germany, you have an odd situation, odd for Americans anyway, in that if a piece of music has been played on the radio, it's allowed to be placed in any TV show.
Oh, really?
Which is an odd concept for Americans, because usually we have to go buy a license.
Right.
But they don't have to. But what happens is now they have permission to do that for broadcast, so they can do that for any TV show. But then when they go for the DVD sales, they have to make a knockoff or a replacement track that sounds similar.
Mm-hmm.
So occasionally we will do, replacement tracks for fairly well-known songs, but we never have to change the music for different countries. And usually what happens in Europe is that they will just dub in the new language over top of the actors speaking German. They do that for English for American shows as well. So if you go over there and you're watching Seinfeld or CSI or something, you'll see their lips are moving, they're speaking their original English, but then they have voice actors that will dub in the new language.
Oh, wow. So that you actually hear Jerry Seinfeld, but somebody else doing it in German on top of it, huh?
Right, yeah. So what they do, they split out the tracks, and you have a dialogue track, and you have a music track, and an effects track. And so they basically just take the dialogue track and re-record the dialogue track. In some instances, if you have a long-running show, you'll have, or even films, popular films that are shown in Europe, you'll have voice actors that are attached to a particular movie actor. Like there'll be a German version of Dustin Hoffman or a German version of Brad Pitt. He always does that voice so that the German audience gets used to that voice.
Yeah, I was talking with Steve Zahn, and he said he met the guy who did him in whatever language. And it's like, I hope you live a long time, because... Explain the equipment and how you can work long distance like you do, because this is really fascinating.
This is all because of the internet and email. It's pretty amazing. I work for these two shows in Germany, and I also work for a director up in Canada who I've actually never met. I've talked to him once on the phone, and he liked my music, and he sends me a film either in the mail or he sends it on an FTP, puts it on a server somewhere, and I'll download like an MP4 file or a QuickTime file, pull it into Logic, which is the software that I use on a Mac Pro, and compose the music, play all the parts. It's all kind of a one-man band nowadays with this kind of setup. You play all the parts, you write it, you mix it, you master it. And then you basically just you'll send him MP3 demos back just to make sure they're happy with it. And when they're happy, you basically just upload a WAV file or an AIF file to a server in the country.
That's cool. You answered about 4 of my questions. That's great. Yeah, I was going to ask you what kind of equipment. So you're using Logic as opposed to Pro Tools, which is fine.
Well, I actually, believe it or not, we use Pro Tools as well. We make a final mix. It's not even a mix, really. Since everyone uses Pro Tools over there and up in Canada, I will throw the exported Logic file into Pro Tools because they want to open up a Pro Tools session.
Cool. Because the students, I've been telling them, you got to learn Pro Tools because that's what everybody's using, and now they'll believe me now.
Yeah, that's an essential thing to learn. That's pretty much a standard. You've got Logic and Digital Performer and Cubase and all kinds of different ones that guys use, but Pro Tools is pretty standard. That's a good thing to learn.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have to time shift your day to be on German time, or does it really matter?
Generally, no, because we have a pretty predictable schedule now. Since I've been doing this for 4 years, I'm on my 4th season of this with both those shows. So, we have a pretty predictable schedule where they'll say these episodes are due on a particular date, and, you don't have to do them every day. You can do them whenever you get around to it. If you have something else going on, you can shift your work around. But generally, I work on an episode a day for the soap opera, and for the detective show, I can do an episode in about a week is what they give me. And so, they say this is the mix deadline. This is when the producer and the director want to hear a rough cut. Just make sure you get it done by then, and we're good to go.
Well, how far ahead is it typically, like for Soko? I mean, is it like a week ahead or 2 weeks? Or
between when I get it and when it's broadcast?
Correct, yeah, the air date.
That can vary widely, believe it or not. It's a little different than the way the U.S. does it. I mean, I know guys that will get a show on a Monday and they have to turn it around by Friday because it's going to be broadcast the next week.
Mm-hmm.
They don't seem to have that kind of a schedule over there. They have a system where, if they don't have anything new, they will just automatically show reruns. Their season doesn't really run like our season, so it's a bit different. So it could go anywhere from a month to 2 months, believe it or not.
Wow.
But when I get it, I'm generally given a week, because by the time it's in my hands...
You're last in line.
I'm the last in line, sure, yeah. And you know how that goes. You're the last in line, and they want you to hurry up so they can have it finished. So.
Do you find it's easier or harder working long distance like you're doing?
I find it easier because when I was working over there, I was working in a studio with a couple of other guys, and it was a little hectic and it was a little chaotic, and people were always coming into your part of the studio, and a lot of interruptions. And now I work out of my home. I have a studio in my home, and I can just relax and just take my time and do my work, and no one really interrupts me.
I want to point out that Bob actually lives across the river in northern Kentucky, but his clients are all 3,000 miles away in Germany or so.
Right.
You told me the story that right about quitting time every day, somebody would come in and say, "Oh, look at this piece. You can wham it out here in a couple of minutes," and you'd spend the next 3 or 4 hours doing it.
Yeah, that was a bit of a problem. So it was one of the factors that made me decide to move back, and I checked with the people I was working with, and so far so good. I mean, it doesn't seem to have any repercussions. I made sure that they were okay with me working long distance. For a while, we had another guy who was a German national, but he was actually working off the coast of Spain. That's where his home was. So for a while, we had, me in the U.S., and he was in Spain. And actually, we've got another guy who fills in. He's the vacation relief. If anyone wants to go on vacation, he lives in Vienna, Austria. So when someone wants to go on vacation, he picks up a week, and he'll do his work from Vienna. So.
Really an international crew there. That's very cool.
Yeah, very much, very much.
Which of the two shows you think is the most time-consuming?
The detective show is the more interesting show to write. It's the more time-consuming. It's an odd situation in that generally when you have a series, you have a theme and you have variations. And, you'll hear the theme in the main title sequence, and then you'll hear a lot of variations of that theme. They don't do that with the detective show that I work on. They want a new theme for every episode. So every episode is like a new one-hour movie. Mm-hmm. They use the same title music for every show and the same end title music for every show. But in the middle, they want new themes for new characters all the time. So we have to write basically a new one-hour mini-movie every episode.
Wow.
Which is a lot of work, because like I said, most of the time you'll get a show and you'll have a theme and you can develop that theme and you can use it in every episode throughout the series. But this one, they want something new every time.
Did you ever write something and send it to them and say, no, that's not it. Do it again.
Yeah, very often, very often. Lately, it's been going really well. It's kind of, we've all gotten into a groove. I write with a co-composer on the detective show. So he writes his half in Germany. I write my half in the States. And we trade themes back and forth. So I'll be assigned a theme for the main title or a theme for the action, or even like in one episode there was a house that was like a point of contention in the storyline of, who had been murdered in this house. So every time the house came on screen, it had its own theme. The house had a theme. So depending on who gets the assignment, I'll write the main theme, or this fellow in Germany will write the main theme. And then on email, we'll just trade back and forth and say, here's what I came up with, and we'll send MIDI files back and forth, and we can even send what they call channel strips in Logic, which basically is all the EQ and reverb information in a single file.
That's so cool now that things are being more and more standardized, that you can do that. I mean, it's not like everybody has 20 different MIDI configurations. It's neat. I always enjoy working more with film than with videotape. Basically, it's no harder or easier. It's just that when you're working with film, you feel like you're working on a movie, and I guess that must make the SoCo a little bit more fun than the soap that you do.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's actually shot on 16 millimeter. I don't know if it's Super 16 or not. I know it's 16. And the soap opera, obviously, for time, is shot on digital beta over there. And soap operas are soap operas. They look like they look, and there's not a lot you can get out of that. But if you shoot it on film and you've got a storyline that has some decent writing and you've got some time to write it, you've got a good week to write an episode, then you get some good stuff.
I think you answered this question too, but you do deliver finished mixes as opposed to individual stems like piano, bass, guitar. If you don't let them remix it, you basically said, here's your mix?
I do, unfortunately. I'm not a mixer, and I've never claimed to be a mixer. That's one of the weakest points of the process for me. I wish I, had the budget, or they had the budget to have a mixer, but they don't, and I don't. With the time constraints, it's basically you do your mix, you do a little mastering, and it's out the door. And it's certainly not going to be as good as if you had a professional mixer, someone who devotes his whole life to mixing.
I've noticed it, too, with composer friends of mine. This one guy I knew who moved to Chicago, I always thought his work was kind of, it was okay, but it wasn't great. And then when he moved to Chicago, I said, wow, it really starts to sound great, because he's working with the guys who really are great mixers and better musicians and whatever.
Right.
And it does help, but the stuff you do, it really sounds wonderful. I would think that because you're hearing the dialogue and everything, too, it's not like you're just composing a piece blindly. You're seeing the action, so you can kind of know when your music is going to step on the dialogue or whatever. That's not going to be an issue when they get in the final mix.
Right. We've been doing it long enough. We're pretty good at, the German fellow that writes his half, myself, we're pretty trained at knowing when to shut up and and when to speak up. And we generally do that in the composing as opposed to the mix. They do a final mix with a professional sound editor for the show when all the dialogue and the ADR is finished and all the Foley's finished and all the music's finished. They will do a final mix in Germany, in Munich, for the show. But in terms of the music that we deliver, we have to mix it ourselves. So we kind of compose the music to fit the picture every time. We make sure we get out of the way when we have to.
Well, that's really neat. Another friend of mine works kind of the other way. He'd worked on the soap Passions. It's an NBC soap that they canceled a few years back. But his composing group, basically, I think they did score individually like the first first 10 shows because they just had time constraints to get them done. But after that, their idea was to make music CDs with specific themes for each character, and then the music editor would take the CDs and cut them to length and put them in, kind of like needle drop music.
Yeah, we do something similar on the soap opera. Actually, there are 4 listed composers on the soap opera, and there are actually 8 people that work on the show.
Wow.
And the other 4 people that are not credited are people who will take this library that we've built up over the last 4 years, and they will look for a piece that fits the time constraint of the scene and fits the mood of the scene. And the way that the music editor will design that is that those are kind of less important scenes where the music isn't as critical.
Right, yeah.
And then for the 4 credited composers on the show, then we will have to write specific cues to match specific moods and heighten the action or the emotion or the dialogue or whatever. So we actually have a lot of people working on that show, and so we draw from a library that we've built up over the last 4 years.
When you finally see the show, have you ever been disappointed with how the music was mixed? Like, oh, it was mixed really too low, or...
It depends. I was a little disappointed at first when I was living in Germany. I would go to the mix sessions for the detective show, and the fellow who was mixing it, he did all the sound effects as well. And I think he was very, he was very proud of his sound effect work, and he didn't want the music to get in the way, so you'd have a lot of sound effects, and the director would kind of have to make him pull the sound effects down and push the music at places. So it also depends on the director you're working with. On the detective show, we have, I think there are 6 rotating directors on that show, and they all have their different styles, and some of them are really interested in the music and really know what they're doing with the combination of dialogue and music. And some of them just want it to be background music, so it depends on the director.
Yeah, it's kind of like picking your judge when you're going to court. You want to get the judge that's a similar mindset to you.
Yeah, sometimes composing the music or having the talent or the tools or the skills, that's pretty much I don't want to say it's a minor part of it, but it's almost like half of the battle. The other part of it is you have to get people that you get along with, that you can communicate with, that like your work, that respect your work, and you respect their work. You hear stories all the time out of Hollywood of people who just, storm off of sets and...
Yeah.
So it's half the battle is everybody gets along and everybody works well together.
Well, Bob Asman, who's primarily a sound effects editor now, but was telling me that John Williams told him that he never writes a big music cue for when the Death Star explodes because he knows there's going to be a sound effect there. So he tries to give those guys their space. Conversely, he said on another show Bob worked on, I think it was Zorro the Gay Blade. It was like a 1981 movie, and Ian Fraser was the composer. He was trying to be really clever and putting in cymbal scrapes during the sword fight scenes. And when they got to the mix stage, they said, "Well, wait a minute, there are extra sword fights there. What's going on?" It's in the music. Okay, well.
Yeah, and that we tend to call that, or at least the people I work with call that Mickey Mousing.
Yep,
we do a lot of Mickey Mousing on the soap opera. We'll follow the action. We'll do a cymbal scrape or something if somebody opens a door or whatever. To me, a soap opera is a soap opera, so it is what it is. You're not going to be able to change the mindset, I guess, of how they want to do business. But to me, that's a terrible way to work. A much better way to work is almost when the music, to me, should convey the emotion of the scene, no matter what it is. I don't.
Exactly.
Hans Zimmer said this before, and I agree because I do these as well. The most boring thing you can get is a car chase or a foot chase in a show or a film because you've already got the action. There's no real emotion that you're trying to convey, and you're just stuck with playing background music. The more interesting stuff to me is when there's a lot unsaid on the screen, an emotion of a character or a relationship between two characters, and, they're not conveying something that's between them, and the music can come in and take that over and say, okay, this is what they're really thinking. This is what they're feeling here.
Exactly. I've always told the students the sound effects make the action seem more real. The music is the emotion that the director wants you to feel at that particular moment, and I think you just said that. In addition to the TV work, you've also done several documentaries over the years, Remembering Kilimanjaro in 2005, Amazing Aviators in 2004, Vatican Unveiled 2003, and you're currently working on this volcano documentary with a Canadian director. How different is it scoring a documentary from your episodic TV work?
This is always going to be a little different, but I can just tell you about my particular case. In some cases, you'll get a documentary, and if you have a large enough budget and you have enough time, the director will want you to score to picture, which means you put the picture in front of you and you basically score the scene. In the case of this director in Canada, he likes to work with kind of a library. So I will create, 10, 20 pieces for him. I'll write the main title sequence, which is like a 30-second opener. And then it's more like musical ideas, which is kind of nice because, I can kind of step away from the picture and just write a piece that I'm happy with and, give it to him. And if he's happy with it, I'll make a few versions of it. I'll make a 2-minute version, a 3-minute version, a 30-second version. And he gets to kind of pick and choose, and he likes to work that way. So, it depends on the director you're working with. Some directors wouldn't work like that. They would want you to score every scene. But he's pretty happy with working with a library that I've created. So this volcano documentary that I'm working on right now, I've got about 10 pieces completed, and I'll write probably another 10 for him. And since the film takes place all over the world, you've got some African pieces, you've got a couple of pieces that have instruments from Indonesia, from Japan. I think he went to Hawaii. So you have a lot of different locations, so you have to give him pieces that fit those locations.
Well, we find that even in doing commercials that sometimes people will want a pre-score. It's kind of like temp music. I mean, when the directors in Hollywood, when they're cutting the film, they're using something there. It may not be the final score. In the case of the movie 2001, it became the final score, and apparently the composer didn't even find out until the premiere that they weren't actually using his music.
Right, yeah, Kubrick was very famous about just taking pieces. And Martin Scorsese is very famous with that as well. He just likes the particular music pieces, and he'll put them in the show. In the case of Kubrick, I'm pressed to think of anyone doing any score work for him because he generally would put found music in his films.
I think what happens quite often, the music editor will get something that the director likes just so they can cut to it, and then after they live with it for a while, it's kind of hard to replace it.
Right.
They kind of get used to it and say, well, gee, I kind of like that,
Right, and the funny thing is, just as an aside here, I will say that, and I've heard this happens, to a lot of guys in L.A. as well, but I've been working on these 2 shows for 4 years, and I've noticed that the video editor will often put in temp music, and it'll be something I've written. And so they'll say, can you write something like this? And I say, well, sure. I already have.
Oh, that's wonderful. Bob, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to the students. I'm sure they very much appreciate it. If I ever get to Europe, I'll be sure to catch your work on TV there.
Okay.
And thank you so much.
Well, it's been a pleasure.